two neighbors. One shared border stretching over 500 kilometers. Decades of cross-border trade, movement of goods, and economic interdependence. But today, the relationship between Ghana and Burkina Faso is facing one of its most serious commercial strains in recent memory. A series of overlapping trade bans, covering grains, tomatoes, and eggs, has created what can only be described as a trade wall between the two West African countries. And caught on both sides of that wall are ordinary traders, farmers, market women, and consumers who depend on that cross-border flow to survive. In this video, we break down exactly what is happening, why it is happening, who is affected, and what it means for Ghana's food security and diplomatic future. To understand the full picture, we need to go back to December 2023. That is when the government of Burkina Faso, led by military junta leader Captain Ibrahim Traoré, quietly issued a directive that would have significant consequences for Ghana. Through an official communiqué, Ouagadougou announced a ban on the export of key food staples to Ghana. The restricted commodities were rice, millet, maize, sorghum, and white beans, otherwise known as cowpeas. 5 of the most widely consumed staple foods across West Africa, all placed under an export freeze in one move. Burkina Faso's stated reason was domestic food security. The country had experienced a significant decline in cereal production in 2021, and by early 2022, staple cereal prices within Burkina Faso had reached near-record levels, up to 45% higher than the previous year. The military government, already managing an active jihadist insurgency that has displaced millions of people and disrupted farming across large swathes of the country, made the decision to hold food supplies within its own borders. The ban was not widely publicized at the time. But in November 2024, Burkina Faso issued a second communiqué, officially reaffirming that the export restrictions were still in force and had not been lifted. Ghana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration finally issued a formal public advisory to Ghanaian traders on February 25, 2025, warning businesses that importing those commodities from Burkina Faso was prohibited, and that sanctions including confiscation of goods could follow non-compliance. For northern Ghana in particular, this matters. Border communities in the Upper East, Upper West, and Savannah regions have long had informal and formal trade channels with Burkina Faso. The disruption of those channels means traders must now source cereals from further afield at higher cost, and those costs ultimately flow down to consumers in the market. If the grain ban was a significant economic disruption, the tomato ban that followed added an entirely new dimension to the crisis. In March 2026, Burkina Faso moved to suspend the export of fresh tomatoes to Ghana. For a country where tomatoes are an essential ingredient in virtually every Ghanaian dish, from stews and soups to jollof rice and kontomire, this is not a minor inconvenience. It is a direct hit to the kitchen tables of millions of households. Ghana's Ministry of Trade, Agribusiness and Industry responded by announcing plans to engage Burkinabe authorities diplomatically, describing the long-standing trade ties between the two countries and the importance of finding a mutually beneficial resolution. The government also stated it was working with relevant state institutions to stabilize supply in the short term. But the reality on the ground is that Burkina Faso has become increasingly assertive in protecting its own agricultural output, and there is no clear timeline for when these restrictions will be reversed. For Ghana's domestic tomato processing industry, which has long struggled with seasonal supply inconsistencies, the ban adds yet another layer of pressure. Import-dependent supply chains are now forced to pivot toward other regional markets or rely more heavily on local production, which itself faces challenges of infrastructure, irrigation, and post-harvest losses. Now here is where the story takes a particularly painful turn, and a different direction. Because while Burkina Faso has been blocking food exports to Ghana, it has simultaneously blocked food imports from Ghana as well. Specifically, it has stopped accepting Ghanaian eggs. The ban on Ghana's egg exports into Burkina Faso has been in place for more than 2 months, and as of this week, it is pushing Ghana's poultry industry toward a crisis point. The Poultry Farmers, Egg Sellers and Exporters Association has issued urgent calls for government intervention, and egg suppliers across Ghana, from Dormaa Ahenkro to Koforidua, are raising the alarm. The background to this ban lies in Ghana's previous avian influenza outbreaks. Burkina Faso's authorities have cited health concerns related to bird flu as the basis for restricting egg imports from Ghana. The problem, according to industry players, is that Ghana has not issued an official government white paper conclusively confirming the successful containment of the disease. Without that formal documentation, Burkinabe authorities have no diplomatic basis to lift the restriction, and so the ban remains in place. The consequences on the ground are stark. Dormaa Ahenkro, one of Ghana's most productive egg-producing hubs, has been particularly hard hit. With Burkina Faso no longer absorbing a significant share of Ghanaian egg output, domestic markets have been flooded with surplus stock. Perishable eggs are piling up. Prices have collapsed. A crate of eggs is now trading between 50 and 55 Ghana cedis, and industry watchers warn that prices could drop even further if the impasse is not resolved. One market trader in Koforidua put it plainly. The inability to access export markets has weakened demand and forced sellers to offload stock at reduced margins simply to prevent spoilage. These are not abstract market figures. These are real losses for real people. Making matters worse, Saudi Arabia also recently imposed a ban on poultry and egg imports from Ghana, citing the same avian influenza concerns, further narrowing the country's available export channels. Ghana's poultry sector, which had been one of the brighter stories in the country's agribusiness growth narrative, now finds itself squeezed from multiple directions at once. Stepping back, what does this pattern of bans tell us about the state of Ghana-Burkina Faso relations and the broader West African trade environment? First, it tells us that Burkina Faso under the Traoré junta is prioritizing domestic economic control above regional trade integration. This is consistent with the broader ideological direction of the Alliance of Sahel States, the bloc formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger after they withdrew from ECOWAS. Food sovereignty has become a political priority for these juntas, and export restrictions are one of the tools being deployed to protect internal supply chains at a time when insurgency and displacement are placing enormous strain on agricultural output. Second, it tells us that Ghana's food system has structural vulnerabilities that trade disruptions can quickly expose. The country imports a meaningful share of its staple food requirements from Burkina Faso, and the loss of that supply, combined with domestic food price pressures, creates real risks for household food security, particularly among lower-income populations in the north. Third, it tells us that the diplomatic relationship between Accra and Ouagadougou needs urgent and structured attention. Ghana's government has signaled willingness to engage on both the tomato ban and the egg export impasse. But engagement needs to translate into resolution. The absence of a formal government white paper on Ghana's avian influenza containment, which is a domestic administrative failure, is needlessly prolonging a trade disruption that could be resolved with the right institutional response. And finally, it tells us something broader about the future of ECOWAS area trade. When two neighboring countries, tied by history, culture, family connections, and decades of commerce, find themselves in a web of overlapping trade bans affecting grains, tomatoes, and eggs simultaneously, it is a signal that the architecture of regional trade integration in West Africa is under serious strain. The trade wall between Ghana and Burkina Faso did not emerge overnight. It has been building through a combination of food security pressures, health concerns, political shifts, and administrative gaps on both sides of the border. The result is a layered trade freeze that is being felt in grain markets in northern Ghana, in tomato prices across the country, and in the egg farms of Dormaa Ahenkro and Koforidua. What happens next depends on whether Ghana's government can move quickly to resolve the avian influenza documentation issue, engage Burkinabe authorities with the seriousness this situation demands, and begin the work of diversifying its food import sources so that a single bilateral disruption cannot hold so much leverage over domestic supply chains. For the traders on both sides of the border, the women carrying produce across checkpoints, the farmers who have built their livelihoods on regional commerce, the hope is that diplomacy will catch up to the damage before the losses become irreversible. This is the trade wall between Ghana and Burkina Faso. And it needs to come down. If you found this breakdown valuable, please like, subscribe, and share. Stay with us for more in-depth coverage of African economics, geopolitics, and infrastructure.